Welcome to Season 3 of The Spiritually Curious Therapist, the podcast for mental health professionals, healers, and seekers who believe that true healing happens at the intersection of psychotherapy, nervous system science, and holistic body-centered wisdom. I'm your host, Jody Silverman, licensed therapist, Reiki master and teacher, and all-around consciousness guide. I'm here to explore how we integrate the clinical with the intuitive, the evidence-based with the energetic, and the psychological with the soulful. Each week, we will dive into practices, frameworks, and conversations that support deep healing, both for ourselves and the people we serve. And just a quick note, while I'm a licensed therapist, this podcast is for educational and inspirational purposes only and is not a substitute for therapy. So let's get curious about the body, the nervous system, the heart, and the wisdom that lives within it all. Today we are exploring part 2 with Ayla Ault. So for those of you who did not listen to part 1, which was dropped on June 2nd, 2025, you might want to go back and listen to that episode first. Because today we're really going to focus in on different interventions and different ways to show up in the therapy room with folks who are neurodiverse. And I'm really excited for this conversation because I've been doing a deep dive into unmasking autism, and I just listened to Diverse Minds also on Audible, which was excellent. And so I've got a lot of questions myself. Ayla and I were just talking about some of them. And so I think this is going to be a really exciting episode. So for those of you who need some reminding, Ayla specializes in working with late diagnosed and high masking ADHDers and autists, both individually as well as in neurodiverse couples. Ayla is also an ADHDer. Did I say that right?
ADHDer, yes.
Wait, say it again.
ADHDer.
ADHDer. Okay.
Yeah. It's a tongue twister.
ADHDer, I love it. And utilizes a combination of somatic and mindfulness modalities with a strong narrative, polyvagal, queer affirming, and attachment-based lens. So welcome back, Ayla. I'm so excited to jump into this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, Jody. I'm so excited to be back. I felt like we had such a long and wonderful conversation. I'm excited for today.
Awesome. All right. So let's just jump in. We were talking a little bit before we hit record around how we kind of wanted to focus the conversation, anything that you wanted to share, but also you asked if I had any questions. And I think for me, just as a starting point, the bigger question is, what do people need to be aware of when they are working with somebody who is neurodivergent in terms of, expectations or preconceived ideas, how somebody might move through the world differently?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think sometimes the answers in the question, right? I get a lot of referrals for folks who are in neurodiverse relationships, right? Or just the couples themselves will come in and they'll say, yeah, we did all this really great work with our last couples therapist. We met for a year, 2 years, or 18 months. And we just kept hitting this plateau, right? And we're so excited because we were really hopeful that you can kind of take us to that next step. We didn't realize neurodivergence was a part of why we were getting stuck. And I think sometimes we don't realize what we're missing. And that's a place for curiosity of sometimes we know somebody is neurodivergent and sometimes we don't. And it kind of comes up in the process of therapy. And so those little gaps of like, why isn't this working? Why isn't change happening? Why are we not getting it? Why is client not getting it? Why am I not getting it as therapist, right? Because that's a real thing too. I think that's where we want to take a pause and think about, okay, is there neurodivergence here? Is there something about the way information is being received or processed that is affecting this modality or this outcome? And so when I think about communication, I'm thinking about couples. I'm in a couples mindset for some reason today. I think I just brought it up. Communication is one of those biggest areas where I think about how somebody who is, let's say, autistic needs to really understand the communication before they can do something differently. That's usually a great sign for autism when I'm working with, a partner and a couple who is maybe struggling, or there's communication differences and we're trying to figure out what the difference is. As long as they can understand the context, they're usually going to be able to kind of shift what that looks like. However, when I think about the difference in communication between neurotypicals and neurodivergent folks, especially autistic folks, it's a completely different intention. Most
Mm.
autistic folks are going to be object based in their communications. We're going to be talking about things. It's going to be more transactional. And non autistic folks can be a little bit more emotional or connection based, right? And so there could be a disconnect between, oh, the reason we're talking about this dream to go to Italy that, my partner wants, that I'm like, we can't do that. Why are we talking about this? Why this is stressing me out that we actually have to go. Well, that could be the reaction because they don't realize it's actually just a bid for connection, right? And they may be taking it more literally than it's meant.
Oh, that's so interesting. So the autistic partner is taking it literally and is getting stressed out by it, while the neurotypical partner is talking about it as kind of like a dream, a fantasy. What would it be
Yeah.
like? I can just imagine us being there, and it's
Yeah.
like a complete mess.
Absolutely. Or an ADHD. I think I see a lot of autistics and ADHDers in relationship together. And right, I'm also ADHD, right? And so it feels so good, right, to connect with these dreams. And sometimes there's an impulsiveness of like, why don't we just do it, right? To feel into it. And an autistic partner might be like, wait, hold on, we haven't planned anything. Wait, what, you already said that we have to, like, budget this month. Like, what are you talking, so it could be this huge kind of dissonance. And so I think that's one thing, like that's kind of an example of
Mhm.
how it could show up differently. I think in the past, a lot of, I would say, especially couples therapists, I think we're getting better in this field, but I still see it sometimes of like, well, this person's just really resistant to this, or this person's not going to change, or they kind of create this like personalness there, or a partner would. And so again, like those kind of gaps might be there where if we understand this is a difference in how someone communicates, it's a communication style difference, we really know how to start to frame what we are asking our clients to do differently and why. I think why is so important for autistics. I think that's why I wanted to go into like the autistic example first. And examples and templates are really important. So here's a little bit of a meta neurodivergent explaining, Jody, that I'm doing of like, we need examples. We want to be able to empathize by experiencing it in some way and have a template that we can work from, right? And so I think whenever therapists are thinking about what kinds of things to look for, that's a really great place to start with intervention specifically.
I think that's really helpful. And one of the things as you're talking that I'm also aware of, that where people get stuck without knowing that a partner might be neurodivergent, is in antagonism. Yeah, does that ring? Yeah, because my niche is working with people who have experienced relational trauma. I think that it's really important because, and this comes up a lot, like how do you know if someone is being, let's say, I don't, we can get into the nuances around this, but like antagonistic because they are trying to control the situation and have power over, versus trying to understand what's happening so that they can make better sense of it, and getting anxious themselves because it's not making sense to them, but it can look very much the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. Or I would even say, right, a lot of autistic folks or ADHDers have trauma, right?
Yeah.
Because of that neurotype difference. And it can also look like they're trying to control the situation because it feels so unsafe because of the relational trauma. Maybe they're not trying to have power over, but they are still in that nervous system. Like this is the nuance, right, that we work with as therapists, and it's difficult, right? I think as therapists, we always have to be curious. We have to model that curiosity for our clients, and we have to be curious. And we also have to really name, like, it's important to know the difference between intention and impact, and both can be true, right? And so we want to get to the intention of like, why is this behavior happening, right? autistic folks are human too, right? They can have a nervous system response and also be catty, right? We can also be jerks. We're still humans,
Yeah.
right? Fortunately and unfortunately, I think, as all of us. And so I think there's a piece of like what is truly happening? Can we slow this down enough, right? And say, okay, this antagonism is happening. Let's really walk it through. Let's really break it down until we can understand it. And usually, somewhere along the line, I'm sure, Jody, you've experienced this in your work, right? So usually, along the line, we find a little nugget if we slow down enough. And it's like, oh, and the partner will be like, oh, I didn't even know that you were thinking about that fight we had back in college and how, I said X, Y, and Z. I had no idea you carried that with you. Right. And so maybe, in this hypothetical example, this other partner created a rule around, well, I know my partner doesn't like X, Y, and Z because they said that in college. And so I have to make sure this, and this. And then, 20 years later, things have changed, but that rule might still be in place. And they're getting really frustrated because they can't meet the needs of the partner or their own needs because of this rule that was created. And that's not working.
Can you say more about the rules?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I know I mentioned it briefly, but I don't think I described it much in the first part.
Yeah.
Autistic folks specifically, I think AD, I think we all do it to some degree, right? But I think specifically for autistic folks who can find social communication so overwhelming due to the gigantic spectrum of nuance, right? And different rules. I think part of what I would describe as rules are like learned ways of behaving in the world based on our experiences, good or bad, right? When I think about, allistic folks, which is what we call non-autistic folks, not all folks who are not autistic are neurotypical, right? So that's why we kind of use that language. There's so many words, so many words out there for all the things, but they often will learn things not necessarily intuitively,
Hmm.
right? So when we're doing an autistic assessment, we're really looking at, when we're looking at social differences, it's not that they can't learn how to socialize or mask or, make friends or anything like that. It's just that they learn it differently. So it can be both a more gestalt learning, so kind of feeling into it, which I still would not call intuition, right? It's more kind of body sense, context based, or we learn it by rote memory, right? Copy paste. What am I learning from TV shows? What am I learning from movies? What am I watching in my peers? What do I see? And then I take in, which I was very much this way as a kid. So that whenever I question my own autism, I'm like, no, that was real. And then we'll practice it, right? And one of the interventions I use with many of my autistic folks is like, let's script it. There is nothing wrong with scripting ahead of time, right? We can work on that flexibility if things go off script, but like that can actually be really calming for the nervous system. And it's also how we can learn it, right? We're going to learn it more like we learn in school than we are going to learn on the playground when it comes to a lot of social communication. And so we can create rules around, oh yes, or we're taught rules, right? Oh yeah, like if your mom's friend says hi at the grocery store, you gotta say hi. You can't just keep walking and going to get your groceries, right? And then instead of, saying like, okay, that makes sense because it's mom's friend, we're like, well, oh my gosh, like, so do I have to say hi and talk to everybody who asks me? And it can get really convoluted because we're not always given the parameters specifically.
That makes so much sense. And it speaks to the development of masking.
Mm-hmm.
This has also come up recently with certain behaviors, especially flirting behaviors.
Yes.
So I want to ask you about that. But I also, as you were talking, so many thoughts going through my mind, was reminded of something I just read in Unmasking Autism, which was that the research shows, interestingly enough, at least they said in this book, that by age 30, autistic understanding of the social interactions is the same as a neurotypical. And what was interesting, and it was like one sentence in there,
Right.
but
Yeah.
they said that the researchers like to use this data to support the fact that autism is a developmental disorder.
Yep.
But the author said that they thought that it was more likely that it just took them longer, and I think this is what you're saying, to figure out the rules.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so
Right.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. As you're saying that, Jody, just a little funny, personal note of like, oh, yes, I got my grad degree at 30. I was able to understand humans by that point, or more so.
Yes, and it's funny because I remember you saying in the last episode, you mentioned you got it at third, and you're like, that's another story. Like, okay, well, there it is.
Yeah, that'll be like part like 4A. We'll see how often I get invited by a teasing. But yeah, and I think it really does speak to it, right? Because if you're learning something by rote memory, right, and you still have really great associative abilities, right? Some folks do, some folks don't, right? You've met one autistic person, you've probably heard that before. I wish I knew who originally said it so I could give them credit, but it speaks truly because we can show up in so many different ways. But the process is still the same, right? What we do with it may be different because we're all individuals, but the process is still the same with that. Like, we need repetition and we need to do it over and over again. I also want to name that executive functioning can impact all the things that we're talking about, right? And so executive functioning comes up with autism, executive functioning comes up with PTSD, PTSD, executive functioning comes up especially with ADHD. I think that's where we know it all from. And executive functioning is very much in control, right, of our working memory, of our ability to regulate, of our ability to, I mean, gosh, those two are the most important parts, I think, for what we're talking about, like for everything, right? Storing memories, not just working memory. And so if you are living in this world that is overstimulating, overtaxing, not necessarily made for you, if people are giving you cues that you're doing it wrong, so you're already having an activated nervous system response, you think you should, quote unquote, be doing it a certain way, you should have all your stuff together, right? Your life, your whatever that means. It's 2025. I hope we're gonna like put that one down for a bit. Then you are going to really have a much more narrow bandwidth of executive functioning available to you to learn all of this in the first place. Let's not even get started about hormones and teenagers and peer group, like all of that stuff, right? And transitions going from like one grade to another, or adolescence to young adulthood, and all those things that may or may not be a part of someone's timeline. And so all of that can really impact, right, how our hard drives are writing all of these memories and rules and variabilities to understand them.
So, and again, that makes so much sense, and it makes sense just developmentally that it would take longer, and
Yeah.
especially what you mentioned in terms of like of the pruning and like the lack of.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a lot to hold if your brain is holding onto a rule from 25 years ago that may or may not be relevant anymore. It's, instead of putting that rule down and making a new one, now you've got two rules, and they may be in opposition to each
Right.
other. And that becomes really, really confusing and overwhelming in and of
Yeah.
itself. And it is interesting because another thing that was mentioned as you were talking, it had to do with, I mean, and again, this could be episode, 4B, but it has to do with attachment, and how
Yes.
oftentimes people who are neurodiverse, their attachment systems tend to be dysregulated because it was so difficult for their parents to understand what their needs were, to be able
Mm-hmm.
to attune to them, to be able to give them the level of support that they needed, especially if their parents were neurotypical, not understanding how overwhelming the world can be for somebody who is really sensitive.
Absolutely. And or if they were neurodivergent themselves and had some of that attunement trauma or attachment trauma themselves, if they were never attuned to, or they don't know how to attune in that regard, or if they're not self-attuned, right? I always think about self-attachment and self-parenting as, key for, I don't care what your neurotype is. There's so much of that that's needed in our worlds for different reasons, right? Everyone's just doing the best they can. I always like to remind folks that, right? Parents too. And I think that attunement piece, right? Like if it's not what we expect, I think for, and it can go both ways, right? I've seen autistic folks who are so hyper empathetic and so hyper vigilantly attuned, right, to literally everything. The world is overwhelming and they can truly just, again, feel everyone's feelings as if they're their own, right? Very strong mirror neurons, very, very overactive. I'm working on, chilling mine out a little bit, but it's been a lifelong process. I definitely fall in that camp. And then folks who are kind of the opposite way, right? If mirror neurons aren't picking up in a way that's translating into feeling the same exact thing in the same exact way, unless there's a cue really to process it like that. And so that attunement can be so different. And I want to also, like I mentioned earlier, right? You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. If the parent, neurodivergent or neurotypical, doesn't matter, expresses or has experienced the world and their own sensory sensitivities different than what they're seeing in their child, there's already a mismatch.
Right.
There's already a mismatch. And so it might just be, again, that difference between like how dissimilar are you two wired? What are your capacities, parent child or caregiver child to attune, right? Because there's a Venn diagram there, right?
Yeah,
There's definitely, and some that might be smaller or larger depending on those capacities. And again, capacity is nurture and nature.
absolutely. And so if we're thinking about this from the perspective of a therapist
Mhm, mhm,
who is working with somebody around, let's say, self-regulation.
mhm.
And one of the things they might be working on are boundaries. I'm thinking of somebody who, let's say, mirror neurons are like off the charts, feels everything, and perhaps as a result has developed a creative adjustment in which they overfunction for other people. Because if you're anxious and I can make you feel better, I'm going to feel less anxious.
Yep.
Do you see that a lot?
Oh yeah, all the
Yeah.
time. Again, as therapists, sometimes the right folks find us for a reason. I think as healers, or as I like to say, like healing space holders, because I don't think we're healers.
Oh, I
I
like
think we find folks who are just a little bit further down the path on one or two topics than we are, right?
that.
It was my massage therapist, actually. She's wonderful. She offices in the same building I do. And she always said that healers are just usually, folks that are a little bit further down the road, right, of the healing journey than the folks they're helping, which makes sense, right? And this is a hermit year. So I'm thinking about the hermit card and that guiding light, and they're leading, my brain can connect a lot of different things, just like the client you're speaking of. And so when I think about like the boundaries, when I think about that kind of overstimulation piece and trying to figure out how to self regulate, I mean, just like what we would do with any client, I think we would want to investigate like why that's a protective part, right? Why that has benefited them, right? Because I think that's just so important for humans to really uncover and be curious about if they can, if they have the capacity to do that, if they have the support to do that. I think where you would see a difference with a neurotypical or, yeah, a neurotypical person versus a neurodivergent person is in both the strength of that conditioning, because we have such sensitive nervous systems and we learn them so much, and our nervous system becomes so sensitive that it becomes so important. And I would truly say I don't think folks who are not wired that way understand the true intensity of sensitivity that can come along with it. I just want to name that. Again, everybody is different, but I think that side of the spectrum is just so much more intense than people really give it credit for.
Can we say that again? Because
Mm-hmm.
and I struggle with this too. Like the level of discomfort and pain
Mm-hmm.
that some of these things bring people. I don't I don't know how to help even myself like fully grasp
Yeah,
that. Because there's a
absolutely.
part of me that's like this is not that bad. Like this is right. Like Does it really hurt that bad? Like, I mean, I'm obviously not saying that, but there's a
Of
part of me
course.
that's
Yeah.
like really, and not in a judgy way, but
No,
in like a
I want
wow,
to help you.
yeah,
Yeah. Like, does it have to be this way for you?
yeah,
Right. Yeah, I actually think it can go both ways too. Like, not that it always does, but I can also see, and I have seen people who are like, well, this huge level of intensity is so normal. Like, why are you bothered by that? Or I shouldn't feel bothered by this because I'm used to this, right? That's also why you find so many ADHDers, especially I would say the combo, not just autism, but like the ADHD and autism combo, so burned out because we can just push and push and push, not because it's not affecting us, but because we are so conditioned to try to keep up with what we have either learned we have to keep up with or have been conditioned that we have to keep up with to be okay or to, like, make money and survive in the world if we have the capacity and ability to do that. And not everybody does, right?
yeah.
That can be a privilege to be able to do it. And so I think it is just one of those things where if you have never experienced this, how can you truly empathize with it? And I think that's actually a beautiful bridge, Jody. I'm so glad that you brought that up. I know you've heard of the double empathy problem, right? And for some reason, it's the autistics that get the bad rap about that one and not everybody else. It's like, well, that's the same thing, right? If you haven't experienced it, Jody, it's very hard for you to be like, oh, I can totally empathize with this, right? You can sort of understand it, but you sort of can't too. And that's the same way for autistic folks. Maybe it's about different kinds of things, right? But the double empathy problem, which I don't think it's a problem, I think it's just a different processing, is that a lot of times autistic folks need to have a personal experience in order to be able to kind of sympathize, relate, and understand another person's experience. And of course, the way you see that come up is that, oh, that reminds me of when my, pet got sick and had to go to the veterinary, whatever it is. I'm trying to find like mild, neutral examples here. And, you've heard me do that a couple of times today, right? Of like, actually, I am that, like it's a part of the cultural way of speaking for those communities and those neurotypes. But again, I would kind of like, I really like that question because that intensity is something that we can't relate to if we haven't experienced it. And honestly, we just kind of have to take them at their word. Not that we are just, disbelieving them, but because it does make it more challenging for us to help them. And I think that compassion is first and foremost healing because the whole world, including themselves, probably have been told that it's not that bad. It's not that bad, right? That's not.
Yeah, I mean, and even around as you're saying, like the need to schedule rest time or take time outs or maybe work a half a day and not a full day or work part-time and not full-time or
Yeah.
work in certain environments. I think that it's really important as therapists, as people who are holding healing space for others, love
Mhm.
that, for us to really hold space for the need and permission for
Yes.
people to do that.
Yep.
And when we're coming into it, having had our own experience or maybe not experiencing that level of burnout or overwhelm,
Mhm.
we can easily move to this space of like, well, let's figure out how you can do this.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right? Because,
Mhm.
you should be working full time. Like there's nothing, there's no reason why not, right?
Yep.
Instead of, right, like let's honor what you have capacity for.
Yeah, yeah. Or let's honor that we know you kind of have to right now and you really probably shouldn't and you are just not going to be able to cook for yourself,
Right.
right? You're not going to be able to keep the house clean and that's just going to be a part of like it's kind of like what can we hold it, can we allow it to be true and then see what else can exist while that is also being true? Because I think sometimes we get into this place, client and therapist, right? We both collude on this so often of like, well, if this is true, this can't be,
Yes.
right? And maybe so sometimes and maybe not. Or maybe we're again, it's that like what haven't we thought about? What haven't we looked at? What's the gap there, right? I I definitely have burned myself out so many times. And it is something that I struggle with. I'm working full time. Should I be? Probably not. And I won't be forever. And if I kind of don't have like my days off, or if my weekends get really busy or something happens, I get sick. I had terrible allergies in between our session or our recording sessions. So it was a very good thing we weren't recording. It just puts me right. And I never understood until I had these diagnoses why.
Mm. Mhm.
I do want to link it back to like spirituality really fast, because I
Yeah.
think one of the things that a lot of different spirituality-ish, new age-ish, wish there's a better word for like the healthier ones, systems provide are like language when we don't have the neurodivergence language. I'm thinking about human design. I don't know if you've ever heard about human design.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, I'm a certified human design
well,
chart readers. Love
perfect.
it.
Of course you
Yeah.
are. I love it, right? I love human design because I think a lot of times it's speaking to the same things that we're talking about.
Yep.
I'm a projector, right? Projectors are super empathic. I only have two defined centers, right? Just two.
Uh-huh.
So open, very empathetic, right? Easily conditioned, really should only be working 4 hours, a day, supposedly, according, to the system. And so I think that those other languages can provide us with a way of understanding or a framework that maybe we don't have if we don't understand neurodivergence or autism or ADHD or PTSD, but it can still provide that language. And I think that's what's so great about folks like you, Jody, therapists who are more spiritually inclined. We can find those bridging languages, right, to bridge that gap between, okay, so maybe we don't understand autism, but we understand projectors and generators and manifesting generators and all of those folks, right? And so we can use that framework, right? Or we can use astrology or whatever, Enneagram is very popular, right? We can use the
Yes.
Enneagram to be able, we're all saying the same things. We're just finding a language that helps us communicate and understand one another.
I can really appreciate that. I find that a lot myself in working with folks where I'll say, well, I'll talk about it from an energy lens, but then I'll say, oh, we could talk about it from a parts perspective, from a nervous system perspective. I mean, it all is the same thing. It's just you're coming in from these different angles. And what it comes down to is like what we as humans have the capacity for and how we react and respond to things internally and externally and the impact of that on our emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being.
100%, 100%, right? Folks sometimes say, like, well, isn't everyone a little autistic? Well, no, but everyone is human, just like autistics are human,
Yeah.
right? These all mean the same things because we're all human and we all have the same human, like human species, structure and genetics and possibilities, right? And so, like, yeah, maybe it's really hard to understand the intensity of some of these things, but you're still human, right? And they're still human. So, okay, we don't understand it, but we can kind of understand it at the same time. And I think sometimes for both or all neurotypes, bridging that, remembering that can give us a starting point.
Yeah, and I think as I'm hearing you talk, what's showing up in my mind is, if you've met one autistic, you've met one autistic, but if you've met one human, you've met one human.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, it's
100%.
we all process things
Yeah.
differently. And although, those of us who are neurotypical, we fall into this like pot where there's like a mutual understanding of certain things. I mean, I'm realizing more and more like how much of us mask and are as confused as the next person. I mean, the more I like get to know people and through doing this work, it's like I'm telling all of you out there, we're all confused. None of us
Yes,
get the memo. We're just making it up as we go along, and it's really interesting. It's really interesting. And
absolutely.
yeah. So, given that, what another piece that I'm really curious about, and I'm not sure how to even ask this question in the context of like interventions and treatment, but we talked about it a little bit before recording. I was really fascinated when I read Neurotribes, and I forget the guy's name who wrote it. He was the guy who wrote that article in Wired magazine years and years and years ago.
Steve Lieberman, I think, is his name.
Yes.
Steve
Yep.
or Steven. I think it's Steve.
Yep. One of the things he talked about is how, so Neurotribes, for those of you who don't know, is about the history of autism and the future of neurodiversity. And it's really a very fascinating read. It is dense.
Yes.
And he really does like to talk about history a lot in general.
I love as an autistic human who grew up learning about history because you can see so many patterns and be able to predict people's behavior based on history.
That is very true. He definitely got into the weeds in a lot of places. But one of the things that I found really fascinating was that he talked about autistic people being the first like fandom base, right? And how folks who are autistic found these kind of alternative or fringe communities
Mm-hmm.
based around something specific, whether it was space or like cartoon characters or superheroes back, and he was going back to like the 50s, which
Yep.
I thought was fascinating and it made so much sense to me. But it also makes sense in terms of like Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, like who
Mhm.
are those kids, right? And as we have moved into this newer age with the internet and technology and all of the communities that are forming online, and then even more communities, and you and I were talking about some of the communities that others might see as more deviant, and I use that word with quotes because and the reason for that is because I think it's important for us to have an understanding of what draws folks to these communities and why, and how do we support people
Yep.
in their authentic self and where they find themselves in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I know you were, as you're kind of mentioning things that you wanted to talk about, I was literally thinking about the Neurotribes book and I was like, ooh, we can talk about, and then you brought up, and I'm just very excited. It's easier to listen to on audiobook.
Yes, I listened.
That's how I did it as well. Because
I
I
would have
only
never
have
gotten through it if I was
no,
reading it.
no, my capacity to read is just not there to sit down and read as much as I love it. So yeah, I think, that book does a really great job of kind of explaining why people who feel like they don't fit into the dominant narrative of what people are like. I love that you said a minute ago, Jody, that like none of us have it all figured out. And it sure feels like neurotypicals do. And so many of my late diagnosed folks are like, well, where is the rule book? Like nobody, like how was I supposed? And I'm like, well, the, there isn't one. That was something that we misunderstood. We just didn't have the rule book for ourselves. That's where we're a deficit on. We didn't have the rule book to take care of ourselves in
Yeah,
our nervous systems.
there is no big rule book that everybody is following. The rule book is individual to your own system.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think when we are looking at kind of the communities that find each other, right? Or kind of develop, I think about it was talked about in the book, and we still have superhero movies now, right? And if you're a Marvel fan, they're getting into the mutant universe, right? Well, the mutants is so autistic, neurodivergent coded, right? Like these folks that don't fit in and they almost have like super abilities, but they also really struggle. I mean, it's a little on the nose when you think about it. Not that we have special abilities, but gosh, I can really pattern recognize in people's behavior so quickly, right? Or I can pick up on things that other people don't recognize because I have such a good smeller, a sense of smell, like it's gift and a curse. Or man, I really connect with animals because for some reason that's just something I can identify with more. It doesn't have to be a superpower. I'm thinking of all the memes on Instagram of like, I didn't get the good at maths autism. I got the, really great with animals autism. And I just feel like that's very relatable.
Yeah.
Um, I think we are so interest driven, right? ADHDers, autistics, as well as ADHDers, our systems are very interest driven. I think we talked about that in the last session. Not importance driven necessarily, but interest driven. We really respond well. We have sensitive nervous systems. Every human's nervous system responds to things that are fun, novel, unique, or interesting to them for whatever reason, right? So if we're already more sensitized towards that, then of course we're going to find more joy out of our interests, right?
Mhm.
We're going to have more curiosity out of these new things like Star Trek, like BDSM, I think is as an example that came up in the Unmasking Autism book that you were mentioning. All of these D&D, I played D&D in college 100%. I still video game nowadays. I can get really into a world, and it's so soothing to my nervous system because it's interest driven, because I can get into that flow state, right? Which is a really wonderful way for especially autistics, but for many, many people to kind of reset their nervous system and feel safe in their bodies. And so, little
Can you
nugget there. Yeah.
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
can you say more about that? Because I think as we're working with people on helping to have access to resourcing and what's important to them and what feels good to their nervous system, because
Yes.
for someone who is neurodivergent, playing video games may be very dysregulating.
Absolutely, because it can be. Certain video games, oh my gosh, if I try to play one of those strategy games where you're like every turn you're trying to like build up a city or whatever, I can get so dysregulated. I can't play Stardew Valley. People find that very relaxing. It's too much for me. It's too overstimulating for me. But yeah, I think I can combine both of these, Jody, actually, because I
Yeah.
think what happens is these groups are places where these similar interests and ways of regulating, right? These people come together who have these similarities, just like in any group of individuals. And not only can they understand one another in the ways that this brings them joy and regulation and flow and enjoyment, whatever it is, they also have something to talk about that they can all relate to on, right? They can find joy in discussing this thing and know what to talk about. They have the role of it. Just like if you're watching, Bridgerton or Downton Abbey, or, and you're like talking about it with your friend or your mom or your cousin or your coworker, right? It's a way that we can communicate about something. And I think you find that in these groups, again, we're all just people, we're all just trying to find similar interests, right? And when it comes to regulation, there's sensory regulation. That's really, really important because of our sensitized nervous systems. There is the social regulation, right? For sure. We're all still human, right? We all still co regulate in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just with a cat or a dog or whomever. And there's also the like that mental stimulation, right? And that's the interest piece. So you mentioned D&D, right? Oh, there's so many cool things to learn. You can min max, you can role play and experiment with ways of socializing that maybe you wouldn't otherwise, but it's completely welcome. The rules are that's okay. And you have something that you're doing alongside other people where it's not just small talk, right? It's an activity,
Mhm.
right? I think Devin Price talks a lot about BDSM as a community that they're involved in because there's a sensory aspect to it. A lot of folks find a lot of pleasure in the way that BDSM, sensory pieces, how they can engage with that, what that does for their nervous system, what that does for their senses. And then again, being able to share that with somebody else who gets that, right? Whether it's romantically or platonically or just interest driven, right? There's again always a spectrum of how folks engage with that. I think you see that in most areas, like most kink communities, right? Whatever that kink is, whether it's, you know, furries or ABDL or gosh, I'm not up on my kink communities these days, but there's a ton. There's absolutely a ton there. There's like anime, there's all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so I think like that's where you see that kind of develop of like there's almost like a gravity of like we kind of find the people who get us, right? And there's all these different, facets of who we are as humans, regardless of our neurotypes. And then it's so special to be able to find someone who really understands it, right? If it's a book, if it's a video game, if it's therapy, maybe a special interest of mine,
Yeah.
if it's Reiki, mediumship, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I imagine is partly, and I think we mentioned this last time, why we find a lot of people who are neurodiverse in the metaphysical, spiritual world as well. Because there is a lot around, especially like if we're talking about extrasensory perception
Yep.
and having community around that where you can talk about it without feeling like everyone's going to think you're crazy.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that was another huge kind of coming out for me in grad school of not only am I, finally understanding humans a little bit better because I had to go to therapy school for it, even though I have a bachelor's in communication, but I also was able to come into that spiritual realm of like, oh, all of these things that I have experienced, someone has experienced something like that. And it's not just because I'm a weirdo from, the middle of nowhere, an only child on a country farm in the middle of nowhere. It's actually because, oh, like these people do understand that this can be a part of your experience. And like, oh, right, there are words for this that I these things that I've noticed or picked up on and I didn't know how to describe them. Just like I felt like I remember sitting in my very first communication, like not 101, but one of those like early lectures. And it was just communication, the study of communication, not media. And I was just so excited because I was like, oh, here are words for all these things that I've noticed about communication and how people talk to each other. And now we have words to describe it. Of course, now I'm like, wow, little baby autistic. How did we not know? Like, girl, oh my Lanta. But it is one of those things. And I think when we come into understanding our neurodivergence, we have words to describe of, oh, misophonia. That absolutely describes why I literally feel pain because the pain receptors in my brain are activated when somebody chews or squeaks their fork.
Mm.
Definitely a personal example, but I get like chills just like thinking about it because that sensory is so tightly wired in my brain.
So I'm gonna pause us here because just like last time, we are like out of time.
My gosh, that happens so fast. I'm so sorry, Jody. My goodness, I could just talk forever.
Yeah, there is no reason to be sorry because I mean this is great, and I wish we had more time. So maybe we'll come back for a part three.
Yeah.
There's just so much to talk about, and I just think it's really helpful to hear not only from your perspective as a therapist, but somebody who has lived experience as well. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Jody. Thank you so much for having me on and being able to share both sides. I know I can only speak for, my experience and what I've observed, but I do think that it's so great to be able to have someone, be able to share that for folks. 'Cause the more we know, the more we know, right?
That's right. Yep,
Thank you so
absolutely.
much.
Thanks for joining me today on the Spiritually Curious Therapist. I hope something in this conversation sparked insight, inspiration, or even a little soul level curiosity. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you would take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone you know who's walking the healing path. You can connect with me more deeply over on Instagram at Holistic Heart Healing, or visit Therachi.com and JourneyWithKindredSouls.com for upcoming courses, healing sessions, and more ways to journey together. Until next time, stay grounded, stay curious, and keep following the wisdom of your heart.